Second reading.
This bill is set down for committee stage next sitting day. Call on Government Order of the Day number 9.
Interrupted debate on the Building Amendment Bill number 4.
When the House last considered this bill, Phil Twyford had the call and has 1 minute 30 seconds remaining if he wishes. Phil Twyford.
He does wish. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. This debate has been interrupted twice now. This is the third time we've had a go at the second reading of the Building Amendment Bill number 4. And this debate has been actually a bit like the government's stewardship of the building review process. It keeps stopping and starting. It never really reaches a conclusion. And frankly, doesn't add up to much. So, Sir, I want to just reacquaint the listening audience with what this bill is about and just make a few points about why Labor is not supporting this bill, even though we have supported, in general, the Building Act review process, which has been going on, which has enjoyed quite wide support from the industry, sir, and goodness knows New Zealand consumers, home owners and buyers are desperate for a bit of consumer protection. So while we support the general process, we feel that the last bill and certainly this one are piecemeal, uncoordinated, and really fall well short of what the industry expects in terms of this reform process, sir. There are one or two good things in here, but many of the provisions fall well short of what's needed in terms of giving consumers redress.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Like the previous party, the Green Party supported this Building Amendment Bill number 4 at the first reading, but we find ourselves unfortunately unable to continue to support it at the second reading and beyond. And like our colleagues in the Labor Party, after listening to submitters and reflecting on the bill, and bearing in mind the disjointed way in which the government has gone about implementing the Building Act review, we are concerned that the important consumer protections required in the building industry are not adequately provided by this bill. Mr Speaker, it is vital that we get these consumer protections right, because this bill, along with other recent and forthcoming amendments to the Building Act and the Construction Contracts Act, puts in place the regulatory context for the building industry in the coming years, and never has the building and constructive industry been more important to the country. We are facing, as we all know, a housing crisis in this country, a crisis of affordability, a crisis of supply, a crisis of housing quality. We've got a huge undersupply of affordable housing. We've got a market failure in the housing industry, which the Minister of Finance has acknowledged. In Auckland alone, it's estimated that we need approximately 13,000 new homes to be constructed each year to meet current demand for housing, and yet only around 3,000 each year are being built at the moment. So to solve the housing crisis in Auckland and around the country will require a drastic increase in building activity, and we must have building regulations that get it right for consumers if that is going to be done responsibly. And similarly, in Christchurch, where the earthquake rebuild is underway, we need decent building regulations to guide the rebuild. Now, we know Canterbury homeowners are already vulnerable and stressed, and we saw a survey recently of Canterbury residents which really highlighted that. And those who are building new homes or reconstructing damaged homes need adequate consumer protections to ensure that their rights are protected and not further violated after 2 years of a brutal and frustrating process in Christchurch. Now, it was because this bill sought to put in place greater consumer protections that the Green Party supported it at the first reading. And I will also note at this point that it does, of course, make changes to the regulatory regime for the construction of dams in New Zealand. And while these are interesting and important, especially for engineers, we feel that they are uncontroversial in relation to this bill. From our perspective, the most important changes in the bill are those that introduce mandatory disclosure of certain information by building contractors, those which create new offences for breaches of these requirements, and add new powers for territorial authorities to deal with buildings at risk because they are near or adjacent to dangerous buildings. Similar provisions also increase the maximum penalty for doing building work without a building consent and clarify the powers of the Chief Executive of the Department of Building and Housing, now of course absorbed into the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, to review the performance of territorial authorities, regional authorities and building consent authorities. However, what became apparent in the submissions on the bill, and especially those from the likes of the Homeowners and Buyers Association, the Auckland Council, the Wellington City Council, Christchurch City Council, Local Government New Zealand, and even Hawkins Construction, is that while the bill pays lip service to greater consumer protections, it is in fact quite weak in this area and it shouldn't be supported. The bill still lacks a significant consumer protection element, and it relies far too heavily on industry bodies like the Master Builders Association to design their own protection mechanisms, which in reality don't and won't be enforced. Mr. Speaker, if the government was serious about genuine consumer protections in the building industry, they would introduce a mandatory warranty scheme administered by an independent authority. That would give true confidence for consumers that their warranties and protection mechanisms were fair and being enforced. And apparently it was considered by the Department of Building and Housing, as it was at the time when the policy advice was developed on this bill, but it was rejected after pressure from master builders and others, and I think that is a real shame. Because let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, why consumer protections are so important in the building industry. And to remember that, we need think only of the deregulation of the industry by subsequent Labour and national governments in the 1980s and 90s. And it was in this vacuum, in this period of deregulation, that allowed the leaky homes crisis to occur. And we've seen the terrible consequences for homeowners when poor regulation and poor building and construction standards conspire and allowed that to take place. And after years of toing and froing, we have now a process for dealing with the leaky homes disaster, but it's a limited process, it's time constrained, and there are many homes out there that are yet to even begin to demonstrate the signs of damage, so it's barely the tip of the iceberg. Mr. Speaker, in that context and with those lessons in mind, it's vitally important that we get it right for the future, and we in the Green Party believe that this bill is a missed opportunity to do so. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I wish to emphasise that better warranties and better consumer protections, although they are important, are only the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff when things go bad for homeowners and builders, and a homeowner finds that something about their property is dangerous or that it's no longer habitable. They need mandatory warranties administered by an independent authority to back up their rights, and this bill fails to provide that. But we urgently need to think about how to regulate to ensure that buildings are constructed to a higher standard before things go wrong and before we need that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And I think it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that building to the code alone is not enough. And there are many who would argue that the code in fact needs to be stronger, more ambitious, promote higher standards of energy efficiency and sustainability, accessibility and intelligent design. We do ourselves a disservice with our existing building code. Now, there has been a review of the Building Act, as we know, that's resulted in this piece of legislation and others, but I think it was a missed opportunity to really address our building code and whether it is in fact producing the kind of buildings that we need for the 21st century in New Zealand. And a decent review of the Building Act, I think, would take those issues into account. So, Mr. Speaker, we have not been convinced by the government's approach to the Building Act review. We think that this series of building amendment bills, we're not convinced that this series of building amendment bills will result in any substantial improvement in the quality of New Zealand's housing stock, or facilitate the construction of more affordable housing to meet the demand, especially in Auckland and Christchurch, or adequately improve consumer protections. And for these reasons, we can no longer support this bill.
I call Jackie Dean.
Mr. Speaker, I do wonder whether that Green member is reading the same Building Amendment Bill number 4 as I have been reading and studying.